No, I'm not doing an April Fool's show. Have you seen The World lately? How the hell could I possibly make up anything that would be stupider than reality? Okay, so the Shazam movie comes out this weekend, and I'll have a review of it running somewhere. Look, there's a couple movies out this week, and I write for a couple different websites. Either way, there's no embargo on it, because the studio knows they actually made a really good movie this time, and they don't mind critics telling people ahead of time that it's really good, so yeah, go ahead and go see Shazam. It's pretty great, and also, like, most of it didn't get spoiled in the trailers, so enjoy being surprised by a lot of one of these things for a change. Anyway, we've done a few Shazam background shows in the past, but mostly centered on weird stuff about the name, and there's actually a lot more than that, and it's kind of weird, well beyond the ordinary
Comics are weird
parameters. So now with the movie coming out, okay, let's knock this one out. As we've discussed before, yes, this character was originally called Captain Marvel. He was created for Fawcett Comics by Bill Parker and CC back in 1939. He was the most popular superhero character in the world at one point, but he went away because DC Comics sued Fawcett Comics over the character being too similar to Superman. This left the name Captain Marvel available to be claimed by Marvel Comics for a new unrelated character in the 60s and 70s, which they would keep in circulation in order to maintain the trademark on the name, despite the character not being very popular. Then more recently, they came up with a new version that was popular, and now she's the lead of a soon-to-be billion-dollar movie franchise, so this guy is probably never getting his real name back.
His name is Captain Sparklefingers.
No, it's not. That's not my name.
Which I dunno really matters anymore. At this point, most people just seem to call him Shazam, even though that's still technically the name of the wizard who gives him his powers. Itself also an acronym for Solomon, Hercules, Achilles, Zeus, Atlas, and Mercury, the mythic figures whose abilities he supposedly possesses, and they've tried calling him that in the comics and a few other names, and it's never really taken. I think they're still using Shazam in the comics now, but it never really goes back and forth. Anyway, the movie simplifies that setup to be very clear that this is always Billy Batson the kid, just sometimes wished into a kid's idea of an adult superhero body as opposed to some kind of identity displacement. The story is told from his point of view and takes place in the DC movie universe sometime after the events of Justice League, where people are surprised but not that surprised that there's another of these people with powers and a cape running around, and it doesn't really bother anyone that they don't have an official name for him just yet. But back before any of that went down in the comics, Shazam lore was rich and detailed, which is to say, because we're talking about the golden age of comic books, it was made up on the spot from week to week on an underpaid deadline crunch without much in the way of a plan, and then obsessed about by fans for decades until it felt rich and detailed. Let's start with the bad guys. There aren't actually a lot of them, as was the case with Superman. The writers of these books ran into the "this guy is too powerful for fights and action to have much tension" wall pretty early, and the week-to-week storytelling became less and less about overcoming strong guys and more about weird adventures and complicated situations where the villains were a secondary concern. But the ones that count are big-time heavy hitters, especially once they were integrated into the DC universe later on. There was Dr. Sivana, who's basically a comic book mad scientist version zero, even more so than Lex Luthor. A version of him appears in the movie played by Mark Strong that's interesting, but also very different from anything that was in the comics. One imagines mostly because he's inspired so many other characters like this over the decades that he would have felt derivative of himself at this point. In the comics, his most offbeat associations were a connection to the royalty of planet Venus and a family of his own, consisting of an inexplicably way the hell out of his league, yet genuinely way into him wife and 4 kids, 2 of whom look like mom and 2 take more after dad. There's also Captain Nazi. I imagine that one kind of explains itself, as does, unfortunately, Nippo the Nipponese. Yeah, that's pretty bad even for the 40s. Ibok, aka Stinky Pintwhistle, a crook who made a deal with the devil to get Shazam-esque powers, combining the traits of Ivan the Terrible, Caesar Borgia, Attila the Hun, and Caligula. Sabak, who has kind of the same deal going, but he's named for a bunch of different biblical demons. And Black Adam, who was the original guy the wizard supposedly gave powers to back in ancient Egypt, but he turned evil, and he actually only appeared in one original Fawcett story, but DC later turned him into a much bigger deal when they revived the franchise in the 60s and 70s. See also the Crocodile Men of Planet Punkus, who later inspire a set of 1980s Shazam cartoon villains called the Hissmen, and a popular 21st century reworked DC character named Sobek. Who else? Oh, there's also Mr. Who, Mr. Atom, Mr. Banjo, who I think was actually a Nazi spy. Yeah, a lot of Misters in this, including Mr. Mind, who's kind of representative of how the whole franchise generally shakes out. See, the big Captain Marvel Shazam story of the Golden Age run was a 24-chapter serial called The Monster Society of Evil, great name, in which the whole bunch of these guys and others all coordinated together to kick Billy Batson's ass under the leadership of a mysterious unseen organizer known only as Mr. Mind, who's ultimately revealed to have been a telepathic, super-intelligent, talking caterpillar, because this property is really big on the whole don't judge a book by its cover thing. Speaking of which, boy, are there a lot of other good guys in this, too. Pretty much every version of Shazam has been obsessed with the mechanics of Billy's transformation, which involves saying the magic word, being struck by a bolt of lightning, then turning into the adult-sized Captain Marvel or whoever. And anything that gets between Billy and the lightning, well, it can blow stuff up, heal people, hurt bad guys, give people powers, powers, take them away, all kinds of stuff. It's also one of several ways good guy characters have become Deputy Marvels, or more commonly now, members of the Shazam family, though other times they just sort of ask the Wizard to do it. The rules aren't really hard and fast, okay? These are very old comics. There was Captain Marvel Jr., originally a kid named Freddie Freeman, who gets injured during a supervillain battle, receives some of Billy's powers to save his life, and can turn into a powered, costumed version of himself. Mary Marvel, who was Billy's long-lost sister, it's a long story. The Lieutenant Marvels, 3 other guys who happen to be named Billy Batson, meet during a radio promotion related to that, and through convoluted shenanigans end up becoming Fat Marvel, Tall Marvel, and Hillbilly Marvel. There's also Mr. Tawny, an upright walking tiger who can talk. He doesn't really have powers, he can talk, that's kind of impressive enough, I guess. Hoppy the Marvel Bunny, who's sort of a parody character, but also sort of not. And Uncle Marvel, who's actually just an elderly con man named Dudley who just has a costume but no powers, and the other characters let him hang around and pretend not to know that because they feel bad for him. That was the continuity that both went away in the 40s and came back in the 60s and 70s when DC revived the property as Shazam. Initially, the deal has generally been that they can say Marvel or Captain Marvel in the comics, but not on the covers, the commercials, or the merchandising. At first as part of DC's semi-disconnected multiverse, but then fully integrated in the 80s following Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover event. Multiple respectable and occasionally modestly successful attempts have been made to get the series going again, usually by big-name creators who've been fond of the character, but it's never really taken off. The characters and world have generally gotten more use as guest stars and team members in other books than their own, especially the aforementioned villain Black Adam, who got way more use in DC than he ever got in Fawcett. But the character had been so popular in its day that the franchise and a fan base persisted in the popular culture even as the comics hadn't. There was a live-action movie Serial, regarded as one of the best ever produced in 1941, famous for having some of the best superhero flying effects at the time, and for its version of the hero just straight up murdering tons of guys.
Talk fast, or I'll...
But for a long time, the most famous version was a kids' live-action TV series produced by Filmation that ran for 3 seasons on CBS, but was ultimately overshadowed by its spin-off series, The Secret of Isis, which technically was the first American weekly female-led superhero series and starred an original character played by Joanna Cameron. Filmation liked that whole thing so much they brought Isis back in animated form as part of their short-lived diversity-minded superhero team Freedom Force in 1978, and for a guest spot on the 80s Kids Superpower Hour with Shazam programming block, which featured previously mentioned series with Billy and the Other Marvels and Superheroes in High School show called Hero High, where Isis, Billy, and Mary would appear as adult guest stars. This made Isis so popularly associated with the Shazam franchise that DC eventually created a similar character by the same name and put her in the comics. She became Black Adam's wife. There's a kid version of them called Osiris as well. It's all quite complicated. There have been several more attempts to overhaul the mythos within the comics to varying success adjacent to this, often focused either on nostalgia appeal or more heavily centering the magic and fantasy aspects to differentiate the characters in their world more from other superhero properties. They've had Billy officially take Shazam's place as the Wizard, Freddy take on the main role, Mary went evil for a while, and while the movie is grounded in a lot of mythos from across the franchise history, it takes a lot of supporting cast cues and grounding from the most recent comics retooling by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, which is recentered on the idea of Billy as an orphan with a new family of foster brothers and sisters, including new updates of Mary and Freddy. And, yeah, that's most of the Shazam stuff, folks. Now you've heard of all that. How much of that made it into the movie? Well, maybe some, maybe none. Maybe go watch it and find out. Like I said, I don't want to spoil anything. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.